Hi everyone, my name is Liz Enright, and as you can see, I'm a huge fan of comics. And what initially attracted me to the medium wasn't the cool costumes, or the action, or even the lovably bizarre jargon. My favorite thing about comics is the box around the image known as the panel border. It contained exciting moments frozen in time, giving me, the reader, the power to control the pacing. As the kid of an addict, I was always searching for that level of equilibrium and control. My dad was in and out of jail for most of my life, and he had this way of creating turbulence each time he resurfaced. Immersing myself in comics allowed me to get lost in the story while playing a small role in determining how it would be read. Within those pages, I found not only comfort, but stability. When I was 8, I did not know that a mind could be sick, and I couldn't yet attach a name to the hyper-awareness I had of every inch of my body. Back then, the thought of my perceived shortcomings would keep me up at night. Art initially for me was a distraction, a meditation on something outside of the self. I drew whenever possible on anything I could get my hands on, walls, napkins, the inside of my desk. In church, people stopped sitting near my family for fear they'd fall victim to one of my mangled portraits. I made my first comic in the blizzard of 1996. Like so many DC residents, we were without power or school for 1 week. The coloring books had been exhausted. Marathoning Disney movies was a no-go, but we did have this old stack of copy paper in the closet. And what I thought would become a weekend fling turned into a lifelong love affair. I drew close to 100 issues of Super Pets in grade school. And as the cover suggests, it's the story about a group of magical animal buddies working together to fight forces of evil, which I usually ripped off from the Power Rangers. Those were probably my most prolific years. But unfortunately, mental illness cannot be fixed with comics, and the series was relatively short-lived. Honestly, my artistic journey has been anything but linear. And I think it's important to point out to artists, especially young and emerging artists, that you don't always march forward and you don't always level up as though we're in a video game. There are huge setbacks along the way, and it's good to just accept that now. That being said, I was a huge mess into my early 20s, so I'm going to include a few highlights. 1, I disguised myself in my grandmother's chemo wig and muumuu and attempted to run away to Boston to meet an online boyfriend. I attended several schools and switched majors 6 times. I was let go of several retail jobs for what could only be described as an incurable awkwardness. And the most important that I want to note is that I rarely finished anything. And honestly, I was ready to forget art altogether and just stick it out in retail land until I magically figured things out. But I was on thin ice at a particularly good job, so when my boss lost an employee and found out I had briefly attended art school, I had no choice but to become a sign artist at Trader Joe's. And as odd as it sounds, this job rekindled my interest in drawing. Working within the constraints of the position helped me develop and stick to an art practice. The boards were always a particular size. We had a set amount of supplies and time to complete each one. And they also weren't permanent, so they became inherently less precious. And over time, I began to unclench and release the perfectionism that really undermined my attempts to start a project. And a year of the job boosted my confidence, so I decided to build a portfolio after hours and apply to an art school in the faraway city of Atlanta. Being a SCAD student was a shock to the system. This is the first time I was ever in a room with other cartoonists. And it was a very supportive and nurturing environment. And I learned a ton about the formal elements and tools of the trade, like the nib on the left and the brush on the right. And while learning materials was important, I don't think I really started to see my artistic voice emerge until my short senior comic. This is also the first time that I touched on very personal subject matter. This is a story about my grandfather, who at the time was struggling with dementia. And it really explored what it was like to interact with the man who raised me, and yet he had forgotten so many of our shared experiences. And this story isn't perfect, but it was a means for me to start navigating a very difficult period in my life. I felt like I still had a lot to learn about writing, so shortly after SCAD, I entered the MFA Visual Narrative program. And an early assignment was to visually interpret a piece of nonfiction. And being the creep that I am, I knew just the thing. I love the Craigslist section. I visit it almost weekly, particularly the missed connections. I'm really interested in other people's fixations. With this exercise, I aim to boil the encounters down to their essence, using extreme cropping and just a few panels to tell the story. The moments are at once fleeting and captivating, but they're also usually pretty saucy. Like this stranger who just loves another guy's red compression shorts. And unfortunately, my grandfather passed away shortly before I started at SVA. And I kept so busy that honestly, the grieving took a really long time to catch up with me. In many ways, my short comic Quench was a part of that healing process. It's the story of Frankie Flint, a retired fireman who, in trying to ignore the past, is confronted by a watery manifestation of his guilt named Willie. Frankie gives into Willie's temptation to relive his glory days, and in doing so places himself and his daughter in harm's way. But ultimately, in coming to terms with his feelings, Frankie is able to begin the healing process and Willie ceases to exist. The story is as much about my own life as Frankie's, and I was finally starting to tackle things like self-destruction and loss. Around the same time that Quench was being made, a friend of mine and I decided to collaborate on this anthology about mental illness. We really wanted to help destigmatize it, but we didn't really know how. So we emailed a list of dream cartoonists, and to our surprise, most of them, they responded with enthusiasm. And this also wound up being a much larger project than we had initially planned. The book collects over 350 pages of comics from over 50 cartoonists. And honestly, I was more than happy to help organize the project. Anyone who knows me knows my life is incredibly color-coded. But it was another thing to put my issues forward for all the world to see. But up until this point, I was not the focus of my work. But I also, as the editor, did not feel great about asking people to be so candid if I wasn't willing to do the same. So my submission to Sweaty Palms is titled Frog Girl. It's about those early years, the super pet years, when I was never really comfortable in my own skin. And honestly, nobody but my therapist knew about my obsessive food journals and eventual bulimia. On this page, I attempt to convey the rigidity and isolation I felt when my mental illness was unchecked. After distributing the books, the team and I were very nervous to hear what the readers thought. We were just a group of cartoonists trying to tackle this very clinical and taboo subject matter. But when people began to write us and tell us that our stories helped them work through very difficult times, it really changed the way that I viewed the impact they could have in people's lives. Sweaty Palms was the first time that I felt like my work could make a positive impact on somebody else. And suddenly, all of those rocky years didn't really feel like a waste. They were full of experiences that would shape me into a better storyteller. Which leads me to my thesis comic, The Sprout. In many ways, this is my attempt at creating a story that I would have loved to read as a kid. And it's definitely made with the outsider in mind. It's the story of Mallory Mudd, who is a plucky young sprout, or gnome with magic abilities. She lives in a staunch underground society of gnomes who have no patience for her burgeoning plant-growing flowers. Unfortunately, whenever Mallory feels overwhelmed, her powers go absolutely haywire, and they leave a path of destruction in their wake. Each time she disrupts the order of things, the further away she is from actually gaining the acceptance of others, which is all she really wants. When the neighboring trolls suspect that she's used her abilities to steal their lucky unicorn, Mallory's home is in peril, and she bravely ventures out beyond the tunnels to track down the real unicorn thief, clear her name, and save her community. She also learns a thing or two about herself along the way. It wasn't until this presentation that I reflected on the parallels between Mallory and my younger self. She never asked to be born a sprout, just like I never asked to inherit a funky brain chemistry. Once she accepts her strengths with her weaknesses, she can take command of her abilities and save the day. Now I accept the good with the bad, and I just try to tell stories that resonate with others. When I initially pitched the story, I thought it would look a little something like this. Delicate forms, a general ethereal quality, but as I developed the characters and the world and the story itself, my gut was just telling me this wasn't the right look for the book. My thesis instructor, Jonathan Rosen, introduced me to some pretty fabulous source material from medieval times that were highly influential on the look of the book. I'm really fond of the tapestries for their intricate detail and rich foliage. But what really struck me were these fabulous little manuscript pieces. It's usually cheeky drawings of bizarre situations, like these naughty rabbits flaying a man alive. There's also lots of butts, like this elaborate fart, so I tried to do the kids justice and hide lots of butts in my own work. So what I really tried to do was develop a style that was at once simple and complex, so that it could appeal to everyone. The characters are mostly shape-based forms, wedged between intricate layers of detail, very much like the tapestries. But Mallory's world becomes increasingly wilder and more detailed the farther she ventures away from the highly structured tunnel society. I hope to show how the comfort of her underground dwelling is in direct conflict with the unpredictable natural world. And perhaps my biggest challenge through all of this was editing. I went through 5 drafts and could honestly use about 5 more. At a certain point, my changes were not amounting to very much. So my mentor stepped in. He recommended that I rearrange the panels using index cards. I knew I had to get out of my comfort zone, so I borrowed from this idea and just went at it on my pages with glue and scissors, tape, anything I could find, filling in the blank spaces as I went. This really helped me see the story in a new light and make the necessary changes. And through this process, I even learned to loosen up a little. In the GIF, you'll see that the thumbnails I started with are drastically different from the finished work. This thesis process has been truly organic, which is wonderfully strange for this control freak. So my work used to be used as a means of ignoring the world, but now I use it as a way of engaging with it. In being more honest and open, I've become a more grounded storyteller. It's my hope that my characters and their struggles are relatable enough to resonate with readers. And while I'm unsure of what waits for me after thesis, like Mallory, I'm going to try to embrace every change and grow. Thanks for listening. Okay, I'm going to answer your first question, and her first question is, did I do any research prior to creating Super Pets, or did I read any comics that potentially influenced Super Pets? And I had read Archie comics, or really I would make fun of my sister for reading Archie comics, and then like when she fell asleep would steal them and read the whole digest that's like 1,000 pages. So I think I had some working knowledge, and that's, I think, a pretty good place to start. But I think, honestly, it was just, there was nothing else to do. So I grabbed the paper and the pen and went crazy, and I enjoyed this a heck of a lot more than being around other people, so there's that element too. And I'm sorry, your second question. Oh. She's asking, did I share this comic with other people? And the answer is, oh my God, no. Because I would be so embarrassed. I did share it with my sister. I would make her pretend to play Comic-Con with me. So I think she actually hates comics now, so I'm sorry, Brittany. Sure. She asked what caused me to switch from the more personal approach to maybe something that was inspired by life, but not necessarily about my own life. And I had to think about what would sustain me for a year. And of course, there's some self-love here, but I don't think I could write a story about myself that I hadn't already tackled prior to this. So I really just wanted to draw something that I would wake up every day and say, you know what? That sounds fun. I want to do that. So he's asking, did editing other people's work influence my own work and vice versa? And I think so. I think the best editors are artists because they speak that visual language as well. And I just feel like sometimes I understand what an artist is trying to do, whereas maybe someone who just works with words, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think there's that understanding. So like we can just sort of cut to the chase and say like move this panel over here and somebody understands it. And I do think looking at other people's work has helped me spot maybe problems in my own. And I'm now more aware of the things that I do repeatedly. Like, oh, maybe I use that composition on 20 pages, which I think was brought up in one of my iterations of thumbnails. So I constantly more self-aware through looking at other people's work. Thanks.